Shared ownership is a scam. So I bought my shared ownership property 3 years ago now. They valued the property at £375,000 and I was eligible to buy 25% of that. The property was nowhere near worth £375,000. But I was in a desperate situation and I just needed to get on the ladder. And at the time, I just wasn't thinking about reselling it. But now, 3 years later, I'd like to sell. But guess what? I'm fucking stuck. The property is obviously depreciated. It depreciated basically 20 grand as soon as I actually bought it. I put in about 15 grand. It's all gone. And if I sell it, I'm going to have to pay to sell it because it's depreciated. So I can't do anything. Plus, I can't rent it out and they won't let me go and get a mortgage at somewhere else. So I'm literally fucked. If you're thinking about doing shared ownership, be really, really careful. I wish someone had given me that kind of advice when I was looking into it. It ain't worth it. Keep saving.
There are 3 reasons you should never buy through shared ownership. So shared ownership is actually a government home ownership scheme designed for people who can't afford to buy a property outright. You basically buy a share of a property, normally between 10 and 75%, and the housing association that you buy the property from owns the remaining share. You then pay mortgage payments on the share that you own and pay rent on the share that you don't. The aim is to gradually buy more and more of the home through what they call staircasing. Now, I'm not really a fan of this scheme, and here's why. Firstly, you're actually still a tenant. Now you just have a mortgage. Secondly, you can't actually rent the property out until you staircase to 100%. So that means you're limited in what you're allowed to do with the property because you don't fully own it. Additionally, every time that you do staircase, you still need to pay conveyancing fees. It's as if you're buying a property for the first time. But the most important reason why I would stay clear of shared ownership, they're really difficult to sell. Ultimately, the housing association has a lot more control over this. Let me know your thoughts on shared ownership.
I really wish I hadn't done shared ownership. Oh, why is that? I'm paying £700 a month on rent on top of my mortgage. Oh man, that sounds so shit. I had a £300 bill last month to fix the fridge. I only own 50% of the flat and that was 100% of the bill. It just isn't fair. Fuck, I can't believe that. That's crazy. Even if I wanted to own 100% of the flat, I'm not allowed. Oh my God. And then to top it off, when I want to sell, I'm going to have to sell it to someone who wants a shared ownership.
Would I recommend buying a shared ownership property? Well, it really depends on your strategy of how you're going to buy that share. Buying a small share and not having a plan to buy the additional shares doesn't really make sense. Okay, it might be better than renting, but you're also taking that liability on. What I would say is, have you got a plan, whether it's an income plan, your profile's gonna get better, your job's gonna get better, you're gonna have inheritance come to you, deposit money to buy that additional share. That will decide whether it's a good idea to go down the shared ownership route or not. Because sometimes it's not a good idea, sometimes it is a good idea. It's very dependent on that strategy. So think about that strategy first before you start speaking to lots of mortgage brokers and lenders about shared ownership schemes, especially the developers, because all of them will say, of course it is, of course it's a good idea. Answer that question first and then you'll be able to make your choice after that.
I don't really like shared ownership, but again, it's about...
Just explain what it is for people that...
So shared ownership basically means, it used to be called part by part rent. So what happens is that there's a property, you will buy it, you can start from 25%, you'll get 25%. Let's say, I normally tell my clients 50%. If you can't do shared ownership at 50%, normally I say you're going too high, because just when I do the numbers, I haven't found, most people that have done it at 50%, I've found have been able to either sell it and still be able to get money and profit to go and buy something else, or they've been able to keep their costs down, so they've been able to save and then go again. When you got 25%, but basically what happens is, if you got 25%, you own 25% of the house, so it's a small mortgage, so you easily can get the mortgage, you own 25%, but then you pay rent on the 75%. So if, for example, the rent would typically be £1,000 a month, you'd pay £750 in rent, and then you pay like maybe £200 your proportions in the mortgage, and then that will be your monthly pay. But one of the biggest things I always say is that with shared ownership, it's so much in their favor. What do you do if you want to get the best tenant possible? What do you make your tenant do? You make them feel like they own it. Like, you probably know as a developer, with some of you'll make them, oh, do you want to change the walls? Or do you want to, like, you make them feel like they own it because they're going to look after it. And sometimes with shared ownership, especially if you go in at 25%, all you are is like a glorified tenant, because you're taking all your service charges, any of the costs is you. But if you want to do anything, you have to ask them. If you want to sell, you have to, they choose the price.
The enormous problem with shared ownership is that the majority of the payment that you make each month is rent still. You're paying rent on the piece of the property that you don't own. And that rent can go up every year. The second one is the piece of the house that you don't own. So the equity that you don't buy up front. You haven't locked in that price. So if prices increase in the future, you haven't got the core benefits of being on the housing ladder. You're going to have to pay a higher price than day one to purchase the additional equity. There's a hidden danger with shared ownership, and that's that as you acquire more equity in the property, you're going to make that harder to sell in the future. Let's say you started at 50%, and over time, you've bought more and more, you hit 100%, you now own that home outright. But if you get stuck between 50 and 100%, the available market of people who are going to want to buy that from you, who are going to be able to afford, say, 75% of the equity, is going to be much smaller than those who could have afforded 50% of the equity like you when you purchased the property. So as you go from your starting point to try and reach 100, if you try and sell that property while you're somewhere in between those two levels, the available market of buyers is going to be constantly shrinking.
Now, the problem with shared ownership, there are multiple. The first thing is a lot of lenders don't want to lend on shared ownership properties, and when they do, sometimes the rates are punitively high, so you end up paying a lot more money. You also can't control how much rent you have to pay, so it starts off low and it tends to get higher and higher and higher. She does mention staircasing, and staircasing is when you, for example, go in at 50%, you buy 50% of the property initially, you'll pay, say, a deposit and you'll get a mortgage for the rest of it. And for the 50% that remains, that's owned by the housing association, you can staircase up. So you can gradually, as hopefully your income increases, you can buy more percentages. But the problem is, as the value of your equity increases, so does the value of the part that you don't own. So, an example, if you bought if the value of the property initially was £200,000 and you bought 50%, you would buy £100,000 is what you would have paid by a mortgage and a deposit. Now, as that property increases in value and say is worth £400,000, if you want to staircase up by say 25%, that won't and own 75% of the property, that won't mean that you now need only £50,000. You now need another £100,000 because the value has gone up. So as your value increases, so too does that value. And if your wages aren't increasing at a commensurate rate, you're not going to be able to staircase. You can't do it, as well as a reduced pool of lenders. Also, there are so many associated costs with owning a property versus being a renter that you have to bear. Now you're one of the owners of the property, and one of the big issues that I have with shared ownership is that also when you come to sell the property, you don't own the whole property, so you're forced to offer the property first, a lot of the cases, back to the housing association, which means you won't necessarily benefit from the huge increases in value in the way that you think you might.
The pros and cons of shared ownership. Loads of people ask about shared ownership, so I'm here to tell you all about it. Basically, it's a scheme designed to help people get on the property ladder that can't afford to traditionally. You buy a certain percentage of the property, and because of this, the mortgage that you need is a lot smaller. The biggest pro, of course, is that you are getting on the property ladder, and over time you can increase your ownership all the way up to 100%. However, lots of negatives. Not only are you paying a mortgage, but you're also paying rent on the part of the property that you don't own, and usually service charge as well, because the property is usually leasehold. You have responsibility for 100% of the property, even though you don't own it all. But for me, the biggest problems come when you're selling. You can only sell either back to the shared ownership company that you bought it from originally, or back to somebody who is buying through the shared ownership scheme. Therefore, you're drastically reducing the number of buyers you can sell to, and you may end up stuck. Let me know your thoughts.
Here are the cons of shared ownership. Mortgage availability. Not all lenders offer mortgages for shared ownership. However, the majority will. Ground rent and service charge. You have to pay 100% of the ground rent and service charge for the property, irrespective of how low your share is. Leaseholds. All properties purchased through the scheme are leasehold properties. This may not necessarily be a negative, but it's always good to know. Limits on selling. If you wanted to sell your property, you may find that your options are limited due to the restrictions for who can buy your home. This makes it difficult to sell your property quickly. Asking permission. If you wanted to make any improvements to your property or any changes structurally, you may need permission from your housing association before doing so. Staircasing costs money. As well as saving up multiple deposits, you would also be required to pay legal, survey and mortgage fees each time you want to staircase. Whilst with a conventional mortgage, you only pay these costs once. Rules. You may find that there are rules to shared ownership, like no pets or tenants. Shared ownership is a scheme aimed to increase affordable housing, but it can be argued how affordable it really is. So it's very important before deciding on any scheme that you do your due diligence and your research. Look at the pros and cons and decide whether it's right for you.
Alright, so this is a big problem that's affected a lot of people. Many years ago, when shared ownership became a thing, the idea was to give people a percentage of a house, not the whole thing. That meant they could purchase with a much smaller deposit, take on a much more affordable mortgage, but only own maybe 25 or 50% of the property. And that was effectively the cost of it, because you would then pay rent to the developer for the remaining portion of the house.
While it seemed like a good idea because it allowed many more people to buy part of a property, if not the full thing, over time, and it also provided a mechanism like a ratchet or a staircase for them to take on more of the property as time went on, making it affordable, allegedly. The one downside is that the government didn't put a cap on it. The net result of that was that these properties were valued at anywhere from 25 to 40% more expensive than equivalent-sized properties elsewhere in the same area. This created an inflationary pressure more generally, but what was key here is the fact that some areas of the UK took years to get to the same level, and some other areas are simply not even at the value of the original property purchase. This negative equity position is really hard for people to get out of, because now you're stuck. Was it a scam? I don't know that I'd necessarily quite go that far, but certainly it was exploited as such by the developers. As is often the case with government policy, it was badly thought out and totally incompetent. So even if the aim of shared ownership seemed like a good idea to get people onto the property ladder that perhaps might not ever have reached viability, the reality is that it exploited them to do so. And that, quite unethical in my book.
Now, I'm not one to make complaint videos, but I've absolutely had enough with Asta Home Cares. We are in a shared ownership house, so we own half the house, they own half the house, we pay rent, they put on unbelievable charges because they own half of it, but obviously if anything breaks, we own it, so it's not ours, but if they want anything extra done, they own it, so we have to do it. We are currently arguing about this piece of land here. These 4 trees, as you can see, I live right next door to Asta. There are their vans, that is their offices, that is their building, that is my house through there. Okay, you can see this hedge that they refuse to cut, which is going into our land. We mow this area, and we have been maintaining it for 4 years. 4 years. Year 1 and 2, they charged us ground maintenance that they refunded because no work was done. Amazing, great. Year 3, they decided not to charge us grounds maintenance because, oh yeah, no work would be completed. Year 4, they try and charge us a grounds maintenance. I say, I'm not paying it unless you tell me what you plan to do. What are you going to carry out? They say, these are all the grounds maintenance for things that we do around the UK. All of them. It might be one of these 30 items that could be done. Maybe. If they bother coming. When actually what they do is they mow up to their border, up to their line. They literally stop right here. I've spoke to the gardener and he said, yeah, he has stopped there for the last 4 years because he lets us maintain this because there's no point. There was a vintage car behind there, he didn't want to damage it, and it's such a small patch of grass, why charge for it? Now we owe them £100 because they want us to pay for last year's work that was carried out, that no work was carried out. But they said it's okay, pay that charge. They'll then work out if any work was carried out and then refund it back to our account if they find out no work was carried out. But I'm telling you, no work was carried out. But they're insisting that we pay that charge for them to just refund it in September. We've gone back and forwards and they still cannot tell me what the budget is based on. According to them, they have no data to base it on because there was no work done for 3 years. So they're guessing. They had to just predict a number based on other estates. I said, why don't you just pop round? Why don't you just look through your window, send a van round or something and assess it before you start making those kind of budgets? They said no, because that would charge extra. Or we'd have to pay someone to come and see it. I said, oh, they could just look through the hedge. They could. They could just look through the hedge. Or every other time that they come, because apparently they come 3 monthly, they could have done it then.
Let's talk shared ownership, but the bad stuff. If the value of your home falls, you could go into negative equity. And if the value of your home increases, so does the cost in buying shares. Also, you're still a tenant paying both rent and mortgage repayments. And lastly, you cannot alter the property and make it your own.